That night, Lise Coleman needed a babysitter to look after her 10-month-old son, Travis. Christine Falling, who had experience in babysitting, offered to take care of the baby at her house. The next morning, the little boy was found dead without any evident signs of aggression or violence. However, the police investigation revealed a much darker truth than anyone could have imagined. On March 12, 1963, Christine Falling was born in Perry, Florida, USA. She was the second daughter of a couple who would be considered very unusual today. Her mother, Anne, was a minor, only 16 years old when she had Christine. The eldest daughter, Carol, was born more than a year earlier when Anne was just 14 or 15 years old. To this already dramatic picture was added the significant age difference with Thomas, her father, who was 65 years old. Throughout history, there have been a few uncommon relationships where a large age difference does not matter, and the marriage is very happy. However, this was not the case with Anne and Thomas. A few months after Christine was born, her mother left the house, leaving her and her sister Carol in the care of their father, who worked as a lumberjack and had little to no parenting skills. However, the young mother did not run away forever. She returned home sometime later and was pregnant again. She had more kids over the next 2 years, naming them Michael and Earl. Although the home had 2 girls and 2 boys, Thomas, the husband, claimed that only one of the 4 children was his. It was evident that the family's conditions were neither normal nor stable. The arguments between the mismatched couple grew increasingly frequent, sometimes turning violent. During periods when Anne disappeared, Thomas would take the 4 children to the forest while he worked. The situation was dire for everyone, especially the children. Adding to their difficulties, Thomas suffered a work-related accident that rendered him unable to continue working. One day, Anne made an extreme decision. She took her 4 children, put them in the car, drove to a shopping center, sat them on a bench, and left, never to return. It is not difficult to imagine that the 4 children ended up in the social care system, circulating through orphanages and related institutions. No further information is found about the 2 younger brothers, Michael and Earl. The eldest daughter, Carol, seemed to be a normal child, or at least no contrary references are found. But Christine was a different story. Living in adverse conditions since birth, Christine developed mental problems, intellectual deficits, and exhibited aggressive behavior. Caregivers at the orphanage described her as a compulsive liar and thief, someone who broke rules to get attention. Her relationships with other children and people, in general, were terrible. Everything became more complicated when she began to gain weight uncontrollably and suffer from epilepsy. It is easy to imagine that in an orphanage environment, Christine endured more suffering, becoming the target of mockery, comments, and cruel treatment. However, sometime later, both Christine and Carol had a stroke of luck. They were adopted by a couple, the Fallings, who not only gave them their last name, but also a stable home. The Fallings were a couple who longed to have children, but Dolly Falling couldn't get pregnant. Some accounts suggest that the husband knew the girl's family, which is why they decided to adopt both of them. Unfortunately, although their environment changed, Christine's behavior did not. She was problematic. Her vocabulary and way of speaking were not consistent with her age. She had fits of rage, and she continued a habit she had started in the orphanage, tormenting cats in unimaginable ways. Sometimes she would throw them from great heights to see if it was true that they had 9 lives. She quickly discovered it was false but continued her experiments. Another factor that added tension to the situation was Christine's epilepsy. Life in the Falling household began to turn into a nightmare, not just for the seemingly generous couple but especially for the adopted girls. According to some sources, the father abused both girls, particularly the older one. This was something the couple always denied, though there are records of 2 arrests of the father for abusing Carol. The first case went to trial, but the jury was divided. The second time, the accusation was made by his own wife Dolly, who later withdrew it. Things were so out of control that the pastor of their church intervened and managed to convince the family to remove the girls from their home. Thus, the sisters were sent to a home in Orlando, where a large group of children, aged between 6 and 21, lived after being removed from their homes due to abuse, neglect, or abandonment. Apparently, this place was more pleasant for Christine, but it did not stop her impulsive, deceitful, aggressive, and cruel behavior, nor her epileptic seizures. After some time, frustrated by their inability to achieve the desired behavior from the sisters, particularly Christine, the authorities decided to remove both girls from the institution. Consequently, they were sent back to the Fallings. From this point on, the intimate abuse seemingly stopped, but the physical violence did not. The final straw was a severe beating the father gave Christine for being 10 minutes late coming home. To make matters worse, the next day, he insisted that she go to school in shorts so everyone could see the marks of his justice. She was not only mistreated but also humiliated. Carol, the eldest, who was approaching 15 years old, decided to find a job to establish her independence. Christine, just over 12 years old, supported her. The day after the beating, both girls ran away from the Falling home. With their newfound independence, their world changed, and not for the better. Initially, both sisters went to a friend's house of Carol's. Christine stayed there for a month and a half, but then decided to look for her biological mother in northern Florida. She managed to find her and lived with her for a while. Nearly 2 years later, in 1977, at the age of 14, Christine fell in love with a 20-year-old young man whose name I couldn't confirm, but it was said he was her stepbrother. Shortly after, they got married, but the sudden marriage lasted only 6 weeks, marked by arguments and violent fights. Christine ended up in the hospital twice for injuries sustained during these fights. In one incident, she even threw a heavy outdoor object weighing over 20 pounds at her husband while he slept. The hasty marriage ended even more abruptly. Following this new disaster in her life, Christine, who by then weighed around 200 pounds, began to exhibit new behavior. Over the next 2 years, she visited the emergency room more than 50 times with a long series of strange and varied ailments that doctors couldn't diagnose. She always seemed very nervous, listing symptoms that didn't correspond to any known diseases. In other instances, potential diagnoses were ruled out with medical tests. One time, Christine went to the emergency room claiming a servant had bitten her, but this was proven false. On another occasion, she arrived at the hospital with bleeding from her intimate areas, which turned out to be just her menstruation. Eventually, the doctors reached a possible diagnosis in her case: Munchausen syndrome, a mental disorder in which a person pretends to be ill, creates symptoms, and even inflicts injuries on themselves to attract medical attention, and consequently, the interest of others due to their supposed poor health. Despite all her strange behaviors, significant weight, obvious mental problems, lack of social skills, and unkempt appearance, Christine had a reputation for loving children and being responsible and trustworthy. This led her to earn some money by babysitting for friends and neighbors. At first, everything seemed fine. Her services were appreciated, and as a result, her occasional jobs became more frequent. Things seemed to be finally going well for her. Then came February 25, 1980. On that day, 17-year-old Christine was hired to look after a little girl named Cassidy Johnson. The child was just 2 years old and at a very playful stage of her growth. Her loved ones called her Poncosito and enjoyed her antics. The girl's parents went out to work, collecting worms to sell as fishing bait. But that day, something went terribly wrong. 5 hours after being left alone with Cassidy Johnson, Christine was calling emergency services. She said the little girl had fainted and fallen from her crib. An ambulance was quickly dispatched to take the child to Tallahassee Hospital. The doctors did everything they could to revive Cassidy Johnson, but without success. One of the doctors noticed a strange bump on the child's head. Christine explained that she had lost consciousness and fallen from her crib. Cassidy Johnson was diagnosed with brain inflammation, possibly caused by an infection. Sadly, after being hospitalized for 2 days, she passed away. The Johnsons, the girl's parents, were utterly devastated, and Christine was also deeply saddened. All accounts agree that at least one of the doctors involved in Cassidy Johnson's case had doubts about the cause of the problem. In fact, he suggested that the police be notified of the possibility that there was more to the girl's death than an accident or brain inflammation. At this point in the story, accounts of what happened vary. Some sources claim that the doctor who wanted to notify the authorities was ignored by his colleagues, while others say the police were notified but did not act. It was also said that the doctor wrote a note for the police, but it never reached its destination. Finally, other reports claim that the police did indeed summon the young babysitter. The officers questioned her but found nothing to justify her detention or to warrant a more extensive investigation. What is certain is that the case was never thoroughly investigated, although the autopsy clearly showed that the head injury played a significant role in Cassidy Johnson's death. After the 2-year-old's death, Christine, apparently devastated, decided to move to another city and ended up relocating to Lakeland, Florida. There, she slowly began to work as a babysitter again, demonstrating the same efficiency she had shown in her initial jobs. A year had passed since the death of Cassidy Johnson, and by then, Christine was 18 years old. Some distant relatives asked her to take care of their 4-year-old Jeffrey Davis. Once again, tragedy struck when the boy suddenly stopped breathing for no apparent reason. Christine called emergency services and Jeffrey's parents, but there was nothing they could do. The boy arrived at the hospital already deceased. In this case, as the cause of death was unknown, an autopsy was performed. The doctors concluded that Jeffrey had died from myocarditis, an inflammation of the heart muscle that reduces the heart's ability to pump blood. A virus can cause myocarditis, an adverse reaction to medication, or a general inflammatory condition, which can sometimes lead to sudden death. With this result, no one suspected the babysitter. The parents accepted the doctor's diagnosis of their son's sudden death. Once again, the young caretaker appeared devastated, and this time it wasn't just any death, it was a family member. Just 3 days after Jeffrey's unexpected death, Christine was asked to take care of another child, Joseph Spring, for a few hours. Joseph, a 2-year-old cousin of Jeffrey, needed care while his parents attended Jeffrey's funeral. Incredibly, the tragedy repeated itself. A few hours after leaving Joseph with Christine, the child was dead. Christine claimed she had left the boy sleeping and then heard a scream. When she ran to see what had happened, she found Joseph dead. The health professionals who examined Joseph's body concluded that both Jeffrey and Joseph had died from the same cause, myocarditis caused by an infection. Although no one had concrete evidence or real arguments, rumors began to circulate in the town about the string of coincidences surrounding Christine's babysitting jobs. Even Christine herself started saying that a curse seemed to follow her, bringing death to the children she cared for. The babysitter appeared deeply affected, and everyone knew she had some mental disabilities, but no one really believed she was capable of murdering the children. Consequently, as suddenly as they started, the rumors began to die down. Voices of consolation emerged for young Christine, telling her to calm down and that it was all a series of unfortunate events. Christine gained even more sympathy when she was hospitalized with a viral infection in her digestive system. But this brought a new question. Had she infected the children she was caring for with a virus that proved fatal for them? But very soon, Christine was cleared of the initial suspicions when the doctors found no connection between the virus she had contracted and the one that caused the children's myocarditis. The general conclusion was that bad luck was solely responsible for the deaths. Consequently, Christine was seen almost as a victim. Besides being physically unattractive and mentally underdeveloped, she seemed to be followed by misfortune. Those who knew Christine defended her passionately. They couldn't conceive that she could be responsible for the children's deaths or even capable of harming a child in any way. Additionally, at that time, infant mortality was relatively common in impoverished areas of the cities. After these harsh experiences, Christine decided to move back to her hometown of Perry. On her own initiative, she decided to stop caring for young children. With that decision made, she took the necessary steps to get certified and registered to care for the elderly. Soon, she began working for William Swindle, a 77-year-old man diagnosed with terminal cancer. William lived alone and needed someone to help with household tasks, shopping, cooking, organizing the house, assisting with his needs, and keeping him company. However, the new caregiver didn't even get the chance to prove she could care for the elderly, because on her first day, William passed away. As in so many previous instances, Christine called emergency services, who found the man unconscious on the kitchen floor. He was rushed to the hospital, but he was declared dead upon arrival. Although no autopsy was apparently performed, the cause of death was listed as a massive heart attack. A week later, in the midst of a hot summer, Christine decided to go out with her stepsister Betty Jean Daniels, who was 19 years old. It was July 14, 1981. Christine accompanied Betty to a vaccination center so that Betty's baby, Jennifer Daniels, could receive her immunizations. On the way home, Betty stopped at a store to buy some diapers and left Christine in the car with the 8-month-old baby. When she returned with her purchases, Christine told her that it seemed the baby had suddenly stopped breathing. Initially, the mother was not alarmed. She said that sometimes babies breathe so softly that it's barely noticeable. But when she checked Jennifer, she realized the baby was indeed not breathing, and her skin had a bluish tint. The distressed mother immediately drove to the nearest emergency room, where the baby was declared dead. It was thought to be a case of sudden infant death syndrome, or a rare reaction to the vaccines received. At this point in the story, part of Christine's life goes unaccounted for. There is a period of about a year during which there is no information about her activities. The next reference takes us to July 2, 1982, when Liz Coleman asked Christine to babysit her 10-week-old son, Travis Coleman. It should be noted that other sources claim the baby was 10 months old. Apparently, Travis had been very sick with pneumonia but had recovered. Since he was now perfectly healthy, his parents wanted to go out that night to celebrate the end of that stressful chapter. At that time, Christine was living with her boyfriend, Robert Johnson, in a trailer. She told Mrs. Coleman to bring the baby to her trailer and pick him up the next morning, assuring her she would gladly take care of him for the night. Sadly, as you might imagine, when Liz arrived the next morning to pick up Travis, the baby was dead. Christine appeared shocked and claimed that the last time she saw him alive was at 3 a.m. when she changed his diaper and gave him his prescribed medicine. She said that, at that moment, the baby was fine and soon fell asleep again. Authorities were called, and an autopsy was conducted to determine the cause of death. Initially, it was thought to be a new respiratory problem or a relapse of the pneumonia he had suffered. However, during the post-mortem examination, specialists found internal injuries consistent with mechanical asphyxiation. Meanwhile, Christine was interviewed by a local news outlet about Travis's death. She stated that she had experienced the deaths of 5 children, and although she didn't know what was happening, it was enough to scare her. Travis was Christine's last victim. The medical personnel notified the police that the baby's death was intentional. The police immediately arrested Christine, who soon became known as the babysitter killer. Christine was subjected to police interrogations and evaluated by psychiatric specialists. It wasn't long before the 19-year-old confessed. Christine claimed she heard voices in her head telling her, "Kill the baby, which wouldn't stop until she did it. She also gave some personal reasons for committing the murders. Her account was both sad and chilling. Referring to her first victim, Cassidy Johnson, Christine said they had been playing outside, and the girl was very agitated. When it was 8 o'clock and the child wouldn't calm down, she suffocated her until she stopped breathing and turned purple. Her heart had stopped, her pulse was gone, and she wasn't breathing. Christine tried to resuscitate her but couldn't. Regarding the case of Jennifer, Christine explained that the little girl was constantly crying, which drove her crazy, so she put her hands around her neck and squeezed until she stopped. About what happened with Travis, Christine said the baby was sleeping and she just smothered him for no reason. She continued to give gruesome details, telling authorities that she copied the method from something she saw on television, but added her own touches. She described it as an easy and simple method. After adding that she killed them without knowing why, she explained that she would place a blanket over their mouth and nose and press until they stopped moving, ensuring no one could hear them scream. When she learned she could be sentenced to death in the electric chair, Christine pleaded guilty to the 3 described murders. She claimed she had nothing to do with the others. Authorities were confident that the other 3 victims were also killed by her, but by then, it would have been very difficult to prove, so they decided to leave it at that. In late 1982, Christine Falling was sentenced to 3 concurrent life sentences, with the possibility of parole after serving 25 years. 3 years after entering prison, Christine also confessed to the murder of William Swindle, the 77-year-old patient who lived only a few hours after being placed in her care. In prison and over the years, specialists have stated that Christine did not actually hear voices in her head. Behind bars, she returned to her old habit of claiming to suffer from numerous and strange illnesses, frequently visiting the doctor. Officially, Munchausen syndrome was never diagnosed, but when she had her first opportunity to apply for parole in 2007, a mental health specialist said he believed she indeed suffered from the syndrome and consequently posed a danger to the public. No one came forward to speak on Christine's behalf, and her early release was denied. She had another opportunity before the parole board in 2017, but again, her request was denied. According to one source, her case could be reviewed again in 2024, while Christine continues serving her sentence at Lowell Correctional Institution in Ocala, Florida. Before concluding, it's worth noting that besides the children mentioned in this case, there were reportedly 3 others whom Christine may have also tried to kill, but fortunately, she did not succeed. Leading the list is a 3-year-old named Kylie Summerling, who became seriously ill while in Christine's care. The child was diagnosed with meningitis, but thankfully survived. The other 2 were brothers Charles and Jeffrey Hale, aged 3 years and 14 months respectively. Both also became seriously ill while under Christine's care and required hospitalization, though the details were not specified. The Hale brothers were lucky and recovered from their illnesses. Today, Working parents who must leave their children in the care of babysitters have tools to monitor what happens in their homes while they're away. Security cameras and even apps that allow real-time viewing of what happens at home are measures available to protect children from potential abuse by caregivers. However, things were very different in the 1980s. In the book Murder in America, someone once asked Christine what she would like to do if granted freedom, and she said she would love to return to babysitting because she claimed to love children to death. Thanks for tuning in to Unreal True Crime. If you're intrigued by mysteries from around the world, check out our new channel, Latin Crimes, where we dive into the gripping true crime stories of Latin America. Don't miss out. Subscribe now for more thrilling investigations. Jessica Camilleri, a woman from Sydney, Australia, decapitated her mother in a tragic incident on the night of July 20th, 2019. Having faced humiliation at school due to her apparent cognitive delays and learning difficulties, Jessica retreated into resentment. She developed aggressive behaviors when feeling threatened or when she thought she was being mistreated, which could range from a stranger's glance to her mother's refusal to give her extra food. Her paranoia grew, fueled by an obsession with horror movies like the 1974 Texas Chainsaw Massacre. This film, known for its intense violence, was banned in several countries, including Australia and the UK. It's about a group of young people in Texas being chased by chainsaw-wielding cannibals. On that fateful Saturday night, Jessica used 7 kitchen knives to stab her mother in the skull, decapitate her, and then threw her head into a neighbor's yard. After the act, she shockingly asked the police if a doctor could sew her mother's head back on to bring her back to life. Jessica Camilleri was the second daughter of Rita and Vince, an Australian Maltese couple. Unlike her older sister Christy, Jessica was born with a mental disability. While the average person's IQ ranges between 90 and 110, Jessica's was between 55 and 60, placing her in the bottom 1% and categorizing her mental delay as mild. People with mild intellectual disability often learn to speak, read, write, and do math later than others, but they can still communicate and express themselves in daily life. Jessica was late in reaching developmental milestones like walking, talking, and coordinating movements. Due to her condition, she was enrolled in school much later than her peers, facing early on the discomfort, teasing, and bullying from classmates for being different. Jessica dealt with the resulting stress and anxiety through anger, particularly towards females, and developed intermittent explosive disorder. This condition is marked by sudden, repeated outbursts of impulsive, aggressive, and violent behavior, as well as angry verbal eruptions that are grossly out of proportion to the situation. Intermittent explosive disorder usually appears by the age of 6 and intensifies during adolescence and early adulthood. It's not just a normal tantrum, but a mental disorder linked to a lack of serotonin, the mood-regulating hormone in the brain. At school, Jessica lashed out at students and teachers alike, once biting a male student and refusing to let go, leading to her indefinite suspension and confinement at home under her mother Rita's care, supported by a disability pension. Besides intellectual disability and irrational bursts of fury, Jessica also suffered from attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, or ADHD, a chronic brain condition that affects millions of children worldwide and makes it hard to control her behavior. She was also diagnosed with severe bipolar disorder, depression, and anxiety. Furthermore, Jessica had autism spectrum disorders, affecting her judgment, awareness of thoughts, feelings, and empathy towards others. Autism made simple daily activities like shopping, using public transport, banking, and working difficult for her. Jessica had obsessions, such as with her three favorite numbers, 2, 3, and 5, which she associated with her favorite colors, yellow, green, and purple, respectively. She liked to repeat these numbers to create random phone numbers to dial, often trying to talk to men. Once, she called a family's home in Bangladesh, India, up to 100 times a day, just because she liked their phone number. In 2018, she began harassing the staff of a meat company in Daylesford, England, even threatening the company owner Matthew Layfield's family, claiming she would decapitate them with a chainsaw. Jessica's fascination with horror movies was another unchecked obsession. She spent hours, days, months, and years rewatching gruesome videos, especially fixated on films like Saw, Jeepers Creepers, and her favorite, The Texas Chainsaw Massacre from 1974, about young people in Texas chased by chainsaw-wielding cannibals. This movie was banned in several countries, including Australia and the UK, for its violence. When her mother Rita restricted her from these films, Jessica would become furious with her. Jessica and her mother Rita lived alone in a house in St. Clair, a suburb of Sydney in New South Wales, Australia. Vince, Jessica's father, divorced Rita during Jessica's teenage years because of the continuous behavioral problems of their daughter. The marriage couldn't withstand Jessica's outbursts, leading to its downfall. Despite Jessica's low self-esteem and her childish and naive personality, she exhibited strong narcissistic traits. Deep down, she believed she was unique and deserved special treatment because of her mental disability, which sometimes made her exploitative and egocentric. Rita, however, was unwavering in her care. She knew her daughter had issues but felt it was her duty to look after and protect her. Rita even reached out to apologize to one of the victims of Jessica's harassing phone calls, admitting she was at her wits' end and unsure how to control her daughter. Although Jessica loved her family, she was especially close to her mother, who catered to all her needs and chose to keep her at home instead of placing her in a psychiatric facility for full-time care. Rita's life revolved around Jessica. According to the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare, 1 in 5 Australians, or 20% of the population, approximately 4.8 million people, reported having a mental or behavioral condition between July 2017 and June 2018. Women reported a higher proportion of mental or behavioral conditions than men, and young people aged 15 to 24 had the highest proportion of mental or behavioral conditions. Mental illness refers to a clinically diagnosable disorder that affects a person's cognitive, emotional, or social abilities. It encompasses a range of conditions, including depression, anxiety, bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, and psychotic disorders. These conditions significantly impact an individual's emotions and how they interact with their community, affecting not only the individuals themselves but also their families and caregivers. The tragic event of July 20th, 2019 was not an isolated incident. 6 years before the calamity struck the Camilleri family, Jessica had been convicted on a couple of occasions for common assaults causing actual bodily harm. She had also previously attacked an aunt and her sister's mother-in-law by pulling their hair. However, she was never jailed. Instead, she was always left in the care of the one person who could tolerate her, her mother, Rita. Jessica had also been aggressive towards women in the streets and shopping centers who she perceived as looking at her wrongly or making her feel ashamed. She was once barred from a doctor's office after becoming paranoid and violent towards another patient in the waiting room. In early 2018, during a visit to the hospital with Rita, Jessica attacked a nurse. Jessica was admitted to a mental health unit for 9 days due to a severe mood disorder episode and was treated with lithium for supposed bipolar disorder, along with antipsychotic medications. By the end of 2018, about 6 months before the crime, Jessica had stopped taking her medication and started using natural remedies to manage her conditions. Rita was so desperate that she paid $2,500 to a medium on Queen Street in St. Mary's, a western suburb of Sydney, hoping to exorcise the demon she believed was inside Jessica. Rita's family and friends repeatedly warned her about the dangers of living with Jessica, but Rita insisted her daughter wouldn't harm a fly. Christy, Jessica's older sister, described their mother Rita as having a heart of gold, always putting others before herself, including Jessica, who repeatedly refused professional help. Rita's sister also recognized Rita's unconditional love for Jessica and often expressed concern that Jessica might harm her. However, Rita's motherly love blinded her to these warnings, ignoring them even the day before the fatal attack when she had to take Jessica to a police station because her daughter had made threatening calls to strangers again. On July 20th, 2019, Jessica felt humiliated by her mother in front of a man who merely walked past them in a parking lot. After visiting her sister, the two women returned home. Jessica asked her mother to order another round of food from Red Rooster, but Rita refused. Jessica then called the restaurant herself 3 times at 9:18, 9:20, and finally at 9:21 p.m. Jessica also asked her mother to call a doctor to come to their house. Rita complied, but the doctor fled the home, terrified by Jessica's behavior, which chased him until he managed to escape in his car. Rita, out of patience and options, told Jessica she would call the emergency number and request an ambulance to take her immediately to the mental health care system. Jessica's worst episode of rage was about to unfold. That night of July 20th, 2019, 57-year-old Rita was dragged by her hair to the kitchen of her own home by Jessica. Using 7 meat cleavers, 4 of which broke, Jessica stabbed her mother over 100 times in the head and neck. This act of mutilation was driven by more than uncontrollable anger. It reflected Jessica's macabre curiosity, influenced by her obsession with the horror films she watched daily. The forensic pathologist's autopsy revealed that Rita had suffered monumental injuries to her head and neck and died from multiple stab wounds with decapitation at the second vertebra in her upper neck. Rita's body also had over 90 defensive wounds, indicating she was conscious for a significant part of the attack, experiencing extreme physical pain and emotional terror from what her daughter, whom she had devotedly cared for, was doing. During this gruesome scene, Jessica's nephew, the 4-year-old son of her older sister Christy, was present. He had been under Rita's care for a few days due to Jessica's seeming improvement. The boy witnessed Jessica stabbing his grandmother multiple times and decapitating her. When he tried to intervene, Jessica, whom he called the little bastard, slightly injured him in the head. The young boy started vomiting upon witnessing the horrific scene. After killing her mother, Jessica called the emergency number from Rita's cell phone and confessed to murdering her mother, claiming self-defense, alleging that Rita had attacked her first. Then, Jessica felt she had to act fast and began repeatedly stabbing her mother. After decapitating and stabbing her mother over 100 times, Jessica dumped the head in a nearby neighbor's front yard. When the police arrived at the house in St. Clair, Sydney, New South Wales, Jessica was outside, her clothes stained with Rita's blood, holding a water bottle. She showed no remorse for her actions, only worrying about what would happen to her next. Jessica asked the police officers and later the detectives at the crime scene if it was possible to bring someone back to life who had been decapitated, believing in the possibility of medical miracles that could reattach her mother's head. A police officer responded that this idea was rather unrealistic. Yet Jessica insisted, thinking that doctors could perform miraculous surgeries and reattach her mother's head. She also inquired if she would face any consequences, like the death penalty, for killing her mother. When told that Australia does not have capital punishment, Jessica felt relieved. She also confessed to the police that the idea of decapitating her mother came from the horror movies she watched compulsively. This chilling conversation was recorded on the body camera of a police officer when he arrived at the scene at 11:43 p.m. on July 20, 2019. First responders described the scene as one of the most horrific they had ever encountered. The day after the crime, on July 21, 2019, Jessica appeared at the court but did not apply for bail. A friend told the media that this was not surprising, as Jessica likely did not understand what bail meant. After a trial highlighting her long history of mental illness, Jessica was found guilty of manslaughter in December 2020, having pleaded not guilty to murder due to disability. In early 2021, she was sentenced to a maximum of 21 years and 7 months in prison, with a non-parole period of 16 years and 2 months, making her eligible for parole on September 19, 2035. The prosecutor told the court that Rita's gruesome murder was the peak of a lifetime of escalating violence from Jessica, progressing from hair-pulling to a deadly explosive attack. He also argued that Jessica was assessed as a moderate to high risk of reoffending and remained a continuous danger to the community. Christy, Jessica's older sister, stated that Jessica had killed and butchered their mother and that she could never forgive her for her actions. Rita's sister hoped that Jessica would receive the necessary help and that Rita could rest in peace, knowing Jessica was cared for by a system that had failed her in life. The case judge offered counseling services to the jury members, acknowledging that the distressing evidence they had heard could stay with them long after the trial. The judge acknowledged that during the jury selection process, many individuals refused to participate in a trial like Jessica's. She also stated that Rita's murder was one of the most severe cases of homicide a court could encounter. She described it as a crime of extraordinary cruelty and brutality, exacerbated by its occurrence in the victim's own home. Jessica's lawyer mentioned that his client had expressed remorse in a letter sent to her family after the crime. In the letter, Jessica admitted that Rita had not hit her and acknowledged that it was her fault that her mother was no longer alive. However, one of the psychiatrists who evaluated her noted that Jessica did not use social gestures to communicate and displayed a rather mild lack of emotion on her face. The psychiatrist also found no signs of schizophrenia or auditory or visual hallucinations in Jessica. The conclusion reached was that Jessica's risk factors could only be managed over the long term with a comprehensive mental health support plan. Jessica was placed in the most stringent unit of the women's section at the correctional complex. Since entering prison, Jessica has continued to cause trouble. On September 9, 2019, just 2 months after her arrival, she threw a teacup at another inmate following a disagreement over food trading. The next day, she was charged with assault at the local court but received no additional punishment. On October 14, 2019, she attacked another inmate, resulting in 5 days of solitary confinement in her cell. On November 3, 2019, she disobeyed an order, and on July 31, 2020, she damaged property, incurring a fine of $200. Another assault on November 21, 2020, led to 7 days in solitary, and in January 2021, she was convicted of common assault again without any further sanction. Jessica has defended her actions, stating that no matter what she does or where she goes, other prisoners will make her life miserable. She also mentioned that prison life is tough and not like the outside world. Mental health issues are prevalent among prisoners. According to the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare, 40% of Australian prisoners had a diagnosed mental illness in 2018. Furthermore, statistics show that 1 in 5 people with mental illnesses will interact with the criminal justice system at some point in their lives. While there is no direct causal link between having a mental health condition and committing a crime, these figures indicate that many individuals in Australian prisons had pre-existing mental health conditions. Research shows that people with mental illnesses are more likely to commit crimes, particularly those with psychotic disorders, as such episodes can lead to criminal behavior. Symptoms of bipolar disorder can be directly related to criminal acts, and extreme anxiety or stress can increase the likelihood of violent behavior due to heightened anger, agitation, or impulsivity. However, there's another side to this. The prison environment can worsen pre-existing mental health conditions, with violence and brutality from other inmates or prison staff potentially triggering or exacerbating mental health issues. According to the Australia Policy Development Centre, a prison is a dreadful place for someone with a mental illness. In Sydney Supreme Court on May 15, 2023, Justice Peter Hamill dismissed claims that Camilleri's sentence was manifestly excessive and that the sentencing judge had been incorrect in assessing the gravity of the crime. Justice Hamill nonetheless ruled that Camilleri should be resentenced, with support from Justices Christine Adamson and Richard Kavanaugh. He considered that her behavior of walking into the street with her mother's head and dropping it, as well as asking emergency services personnel whether they could reattach it, demonstrated the extent to which her conduct was divorced from the real world. Based on the evidence of multiple psychiatrists and a psychologist, Justice Hamill found Camilleri had only a simple understanding of moral wrongfulness due to her intellectual disability and autism spectrum disorder. He ordered that she be resentenced to a prison term of 16 years with a non-parole period of 12 years. And so, dear viewers, this concludes today's episode of Unreal True Crime. Please remember to subscribe and like if you appreciate my work. Good night, and I'll see you in the next crime story. Rossana Galliano was having dinner with her sister Monica in the living room of her house in El Remanso Exaltación de la Cruz when her phone rang. It was her husband, Jose Arce, calling to say he was running late to pick up their sons, Geronimo and Nehuen, ages 4 and 3. Rossana answered the call, but, struggling to hear, stepped out into the garden to talk. As she tried to communicate with Jose, a figure emerged from the trees, took a few steps toward her, and pulled out a gun. The assailant fired 6 shots, leaving 29-year-old Rossana's body just steps from her home, struck by 4 bullets. Rossana Galliano was born in the late 1970s in Buenos Aires, Argentina. She was the youngest child, with 2 brothers named Oscar and Gustavo, and a sister named Monica. Her parents were Reynaldo and Graciela. The details of her childhood and teenage years are a bit of a mystery, but it's known that she finished high school in the late 90s. During this time, Rossana's dad, Reynaldo, worked as a mechanic. Early in 2001, Jose Arch showed up at Reynaldo's workshop. Jose was born on November 22, 1948. He had lived abroad for over 30 years, in places like Greece and the United States, where he even spent 4 years in prison for drug trafficking. Eventually, Jose returned to Argentina in 1996, owning 8 properties in a posh area of Buenos Aires. Jose and Rosana met when he brought his vintage car for repairs at her father's shop. Despite the significant age difference, they started dating quickly. At that time, Rosana was unemployed and quite reserved. Jose appeared to be financially stable, but in reality, his wealth came from his mother, Elsa, who was still in the United States. When Jose, at the age of 52, proposed to 22-year-old Rosana, her mother Graciela questioned if he was too old for her daughter. Jose argued that love knew no age. Looking for assurance, Graciela turned to Rosana, who, in a whisper, confirmed her desire to marry him. The couple got married on November 17, 2001, after just 7 months of dating. Jose claimed that his cheerful, modern, and smart personality won Rosana over. Soon after, they had a son named Geronimo. But not long after, problems began to show. Jose was a controlling and jealous man who often belittled Rosana and her family. This abuse eventually became physical, leaving Rosana feeling trapped and fearful. Jose's intimidating presence, reinforced by owning 2 guns, ensured he kept control, a situation that Rosana's family was painfully aware of. It was common for Jose to show off his guns, either when someone visited their home or when he was out visiting others. One time, while painting their house, Rosana's brother Oscar witnessed Jose physically assaulting her, telling her to shut up before hitting her. On another occasion, her father noticed bruises on Rosana's back, and she simply told him that Jose had dragged her across the pavement. Despite these troubles, Rosana and Jose welcomed their second child, and Rosana tried her best to make the relationship work, hoping to provide a stable home for their children. However, her efforts were constantly undermined by Jose's temper and disrespectful behavior. To make matters worse, Jose's mother, Elsa, controlled the household from afar, making decisions about their lives during her short visits to Argentina. By 2006, Rosana had endured unbearable abuse and finally reported Jose for domestic violence. Her family was largely unaware of the full extent of her suffering. Months later, Rosana filed a second complaint, including a request for a medical examination due to her injuries. Following this, she opened up to her sister Monica, and they made a pact to communicate whenever something happened. Monica became her sanctuary and support. Whenever life with Jose became unbearable, Rosana would visit Monica's apartment with her children, though Jose dictated when they must return, often with death threats. At times, he verbally abused Rosana, criticizing her abilities as a mother. Eventually, she decided to move in with Monica and the children, while Jose stayed at his house. After some time, Rosana filed another complaint and sought a divorce, resulting in a restraining order against Jose. They only met at a neutral property in El Remanso, Exaltación de la Cruz, for child visitation, as arranged by the court. It was there that Rosana shared the extent of her ordeal with the gardener. Daniel Gonzalez, who lived nearby, was married and had a daughter. Rumors suggested a secret romance between Rosana and Daniel, but this was never confirmed. Jose's threats continued, and Rosana even played a voicemail for her brother Oscar in which Jose talked about killing her. In mid-2007, while hanging out with friends at a bar, Rosana met Oscar Lugo. He was 32, lived in Marino, and worked in a sewing workshop. They hit it off immediately, exchanged numbers, and started dating. Oscar Lugo was old-fashioned, a gentleman who was kind, attentive, and listened to her. For 29-year-old Rossana, who had been through endless turmoil, it felt like she was rediscovering a nearly forgotten life. Oscar Lugo noticed Rossana's lack of confidence and the fear in her. By December 2007, he had joined her for the holiday festivities, even dressing up as Santa Claus to delight her sons. But the happiness was marred by Jose, who kept tabs on Rossana's every move. Aware of her new relationship and panicked by the looming divorce, Jose called Rossana, offering her a truck to end things with Oscar Lugo. She refused, and it was her new boyfriend who accompanied her to the hospital during a severe nervous breakdown. Out of options, Jose hatched a plan, financed by his mother, Elsa. They meticulously arranged to hire a hitman whose identity remains a mystery. On January 16, 2008, Rossana and her sister Monica went to El Remanso to pick up her sons, age 4 and 3. The handover was delayed by Jose with excuses. At 9:15 p.m., Jose called, claiming Geronimo had a fever and he would take him to the hospital and return him the next day. However, Rossana insisted on having the children back to care for Geronimo herself. The call was brief, and then she went inside. Around 9:53 p.m., Rossana texted Oscar Lugo with a casual message about their plans for the next day. At 10 p.m., Rossana and Monica sat down for dinner. At 10:50 p.m., Jose called again, and this conversation turned into a deadly trap. Rossana went out to the garden for better reception, where a shadowy figure emerged from behind the trees and shot her 4 times with a .45 caliber gun. Hearing the shots, Monica screamed, saw Rossana stagger and collapse. Frantic, Monica tried calling 911 without success, then asked her boyfriend to alert the police. Meanwhile, Oscar Lugo, unaware of the events, tried contacting Rossana at 11 p.m. and failing that, tried to reach Monica but got no response. Police investigations revealed that the shooter had entered from an adjacent vacant lot. A witness saw someone fleeing through a gap in the fence but couldn't provide a clear description due to the darkness. That night, Jose was questioned and appeared shocked. After requesting a lawyer, he let the lawyer handle the proceedings and left. The next day, during further searches, a red sweater was found, which Rossana's relatives believed belonged to Jose, making him the prime suspect in their eyes. The case grabbed media attention and shocked the country, becoming scandalous as Jose and his mother publicly claimed his innocence and talked bad about Rossana, suggesting she had multiple lovers and those men should be investigated instead. After the incident, Daniel, the gardener, became reclusive, speaking to no one. On the night of Rossana's funeral, Reynaldo noticed Jose nearby in a truck, watching from a distance without joining or expressing condolences. Jose's defense later targeted Monica, Rossana's sister and the sole witness, raising doubts about her by questioning why there were no bloodstains on her clothes and why she ran for her phone instead of helping her sister. However, this theory was unsupported. The investigators argued the weapon was too heavy for a woman to manage. An important point raised by the detectives was that anyone familiar with the house would know Rossana needed to go outside to get a cell signal, indicating significant premeditation in the crime. During the investigation, Rossana's sons were cared for by their father and grandmother Elsa, while their grandmother Graciela could see them. However, Monica and Oscar were denied access, with Jose claiming serious safety concerns for his sons. Despite the legal restrictions, the children expressed a desire to see their Aunt Monica, leading Jose to occasionally allow visits. Monica used these opportunities to take them to a psychologist. Eventually, Graciela obtained visitation rights, though not guardianship. In an interview at the time, Jose alleged that Rosana had 4 lovers, all with legal troubles. According to Jose, Rosana was intimate with these men to uncover their secrets, which she then used to blackmail them for benefits. Meanwhile, after receiving threats, Oscar was made a protected witness in his sister's case, requiring him to wear a tracking bracelet and being assigned police protection. As 2007 was ending, the investigators had yet to find solid evidence to charge any of the suspects. However, a significant turn came a year after the murder when Jose was arrested in January 2008, charged with aggravated homicide due to their relationship, premeditation, and the involvement of 2 or more people. The preliminary hearings began on January 28, 2008. Reynaldo, Graciela, Monica, and Oscar testified about Jose's repeated threats, violent nature, and use of firearms for intimidation. The mother also presented the last text messages from her daughter to the prosecutor. After the hearing, Reynaldo expressed feeling a heavy burden but found relief in fulfilling his duty to his daughter's memory. The next day, Oscar Lugo, Rosana's former boyfriend, testified against Jose, describing him similarly to the family's view. He mentioned Jose's attempts to tarnish his and Rosana's reputations, adding that Rosana believed Jose's claims of her having multiple lovers were a tactic to discredit her in their impending divorce. Jose's lawyer downplayed the allegations of Jose's emotional instability and aggression, suggesting they were echoing Rosana's narrative. On February 7, 2008, a 12-hour investigative session took place, with Jose's mother traveling from the United States for her turn to testify. Meanwhile, a new search at El Remanso yielded no new evidence. By then, Rosana's family suspected her mother-in-law's involvement in the plot. As a result, Reynaldo and Graciela's lawyer considered requesting her arrest. In defense, Jose and his mother's lawyer argued that Jose's mother had stated in her testimony that she bought houses for her grandchildren, believing the divorce settlement would not harm them. It was also added that it was untrue that Jose's mother and Rosana had a bad relationship. The media continued to debate the circumstances of Rosana's death and the notion that Jose orchestrated the murder, hinting at another perpetrator. Despite the suspicions, Jose was released on bail and took care of his children. Later, the court deemed the police protection for Oscar, Rosana's brother who worked as a taxi driver, unnecessary. On the early morning of July 5, 2008, Oscar was attacked by 2 armed men. They beat and threatened him for an hour before abandoning him in a vacant lot, where he was found thanks to his protective witness tracking bracelet. Though not severely injured, he was deeply shaken. Amidst the grief of losing Rosana and the ongoing custody battle, the family faced renewed fear, a fear that was palpable and justified. With no one convicted and ongoing threats, the demand for justice grew more urgent, yet the judicial system's slow pace was disheartening. Years passed, and by 2012, the trial and custody dispute dragged on. 4 years after the attack, Oscar used his visitation rights to take his nephews to play soccer, sharing a memorable hug with the 6- and 7-year-old boys. In April 2013, the oral trial started. Jose maintained his innocence. In May, proceedings were delayed when Jose suffered a stroke, pushing the final verdict to November 2013. The judges found that the murder was meticulously planned, resembling organized crime. Jose and Elsa were implicated in choosing the time and place for the attack, knowing that a phone call would lure Rosanna outside, making her vulnerable. The court found financial motives behind the murder, as Jose did not want to split the marital assets. Jose and Elsa were sentenced to life imprisonment. The conviction was upheld by the higher court, highlighting Jose's threats, the domestic violence endured by Rosanna, and the dominant influence of his mother. The actual shooters were never identified. In 2015, Jose and Elsa received house arrest, Jose due to his health and Elsa due to her age, allowing the kids to live with them again. The media continued to cover the children's story for years, during which time Monica and Graciela had no contact with them. The boys shuffled between homes known to their father but strangers to Rosanna's family. In the second week of January 2017, the court allowed the children to spend a weekend with their maternal grandparents for the first time. The Galliano family prepared their home with fresh paint, a thorough cleaning, and decorations. They hung balloons and made a colorful welcome sign. Graciela prepared their favorite dish. That weekend, the Galliano home was filled with joy as the boys played soccer, video games, and even asked to sleep in their grandmother's bed, whom they hadn't seen in over 2 years. On November 24, 2018, Jose died after another stroke. The event was another blow for the children, who attended their father's funeral. During the funeral, they expressed their concern about their future with their Aunt Monica. She assured them with calmness and love, promising to support whatever they decided. They chose to live with Monica, who then had to confront Elsa to communicate the boys' decision. Through these and many other instances, it was clear that Monica always acted in alignment with her nephew's wishes, whether they wanted to talk or preferred silence. Monica's primary goal was to provide stability and comfort for the boys. In March 2019, Geronimo chose not to change schools since he was close to his friends and had 2 years left there, so he went back to live with his grandmother Elsa. Meanwhile, Monica sought custody of the other kid. Things seemed to be stabilizing, but in the last week of November 2019, 87-year-old Elsa was moved from her home to the hospital, where she passed away on November 30th. The following month, Monica was granted custody of Nahuen. By year's end, Geronimo moved in with a friend of his grandmother. Both brothers continued to need psychological support to process their experiences, with Geronimo struggling with depression. Their psychologist noted the overwhelming succession of events they faced. In March 2020, just before pandemic restrictions started, the person Geronimo was living with passed away, leading him to seek refuge with his Aunt Monica until October 2020. Upon turning 18, Geronimo rented a small apartment and lived independently, supported by income from his inherited properties. Monica began legal proceedings to secure their inheritance, fearing they might be deprived of their assets. Nahuen, meanwhile, showed emotional stability thanks to the support he received, and was encouraged to return to therapy whenever needed. And so, dear viewers, this concludes today's episode of Unreal True Crime. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you appreciate my work. Good night and see you in the next crime story.